let's bring in Robin Sheng, Chief China Economist here at Morgan Stanley, to tell us a bit more about your takeaway from these numbers, Robin.
It's soft. Fourth quarter is tracking at probably in real term 4.5%, below the third quarter's 4.8%. But what matters more for investors is nominal GDP growth, which is tracking at a very subdued level of below 4%, given these numbers you mentioned. I think consumption is the biggest concern. Retail sales are slowing because the trade-in effects are diminishing, and also property is a big drag. Inventory is high, broader price declines, fragile confidence in property. However, you can see policy are in cruise control at this moment.
Yes. Why do you think there's a lack of urgency?
I would say for the full year, they achieved 5%. And from the CEWC, the work conference, the key message is to continue to focus on advanced manufacturing, on tech innovation. So it looks like for next year, that's the key message. There is a small nudge to domestic demand, but it's probably not enough.
So how are you looking at 2026 now? Is it going to be much challenging, given the fact that you say 5% is pretty attainable for 2025?
So we are running at 4.8% in real growth for 26 and 4.1% in nominal growth. That's our expectation. It's time, and again, it's below consensus on nominal GDP. So it's another year of slow burn for reflation in China.
Yeah.
And the reason is if you look at the policymakers, fiscal envelope is likely to remain flat versus 2025. I mean, of course, they may allocate a little bit more from that flat deficit to something like domestic demand, consumption, but it's still quite modest pace. And on property, the key message here is guardrails over bailouts, right? So far, all this evidence showed they are less interested in a big rescue plan, be it inventory purchase or nationalizing developers. More likely, if the stress deepens, they can provide a little bit subsidy on mortgages.
Yeah.
All of these are showing for next year policy will remain reactive and small.
The consumption side is still, as you mentioned, I mean, that's quite a miss, right, for 1.3% for retail sales. There is some chatter, I guess, from the Work Economic Conference about optimizing the trade-in programs. What would that entail? Do you think that would mean Beijing is willing to increase funding or just kind of keep things from slowing down further?
Well, you are right. There is a lot of precautionary saving due to this incomplete social safety net in China.
Yeah.
So to get consumption back on a firmer footing, they need three things. Cyclically, they can do trade-in programs, widening the coverage of category of goods.
Services.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Probably some services vouchers. But meanwhile, they have to stabilize housing sector. So again, that subsidy on mortgage interest rates, which your colleagues reported about 3 weeks ago.
How effective would that be?
I think it's going to be a stabilizer. It's not going to reflating prices that much because it depends on the duration, the magnitude, and how they communicate this subsidy. But if they do it, at least it's going to make the cycle smoother, probably shortening the painful period of inventory digestion. But the last but not least, social welfare. We mentioned the incomplete social safety net. That's the key reason why consumers, even farmers, migrant workers are saving, not spending. So they have to provide that injection from central government budget to farmers and the migrant workers' social welfare accounts. So if they deliver all three things, I think it's going to anchor a reflation and a rebalance in China.
What about in terms of investment? You've written a lot about this, right? The declines that we've been seeing. What more do you think they can do to revive investment without really putting that fiscal burden on local governments?
In a more practical policy-making framework, I think they will use investment as the near-term anchor for growth. Consumption, well, they will definitely deliver a little bit more, but in near-term Q1, Q2, they will front-load the local special bond issuance with a tilt into infrastructure like underground pipelines. They call it urban renewal programs, green capex, as well as AI data center. So I do think more public capex is probably the near-term anchor for policymakers to achieve the 5% target for next year. But over the medium term, they need to rebalance towards consumption. So again, it's back to all these tools we are expecting on the consumer side, be it services vouchers, this stabilization of housing sector, plus social welfare injection.
The consumption side, I mean, you're seeing regulators are a bit more, I guess you could say, harsher in terms of their, how these automakers, for example, are pricing their vehicles, right? We heard from the regulator over the weekend about, now there's going to be legal consequences if you price your cars below production cost and the like. But up until now, we really haven't seen some of these, car companies really adhere to this sort of anti-involution campaign. And we've seen that, right? Whether it's food delivery, autos, that continue to be quite weak. Should we expect any sort of change when it comes to anti-involution next year, beyond just what we see in the material side of things? I think that's where we're seeing most of the supply cuts and the like, but where else can we see that anti-involution campaign take effect?
Well, I think the deep-rooted reason for involution in China is there has been this supply-centric business model and policy framework over the last 2 decades. Too much focus on supply, production, investment, too little focus on consumption, services, and rewarding household well-beings. Now that's changing, but in a very subtle way. So over the weekends, there are so many official media interpreting the CWC. And one of them mentioned they do want to invest more in people-first investment in social welfare, education, healthcare. And if they can boost the domestic demand with that kind of social welfare reform, with enough demand, then you don't have to do all this cutthroating, price competition. So demand stimulus is the key here. You can't just do anti-involution with some supply-side consolidation.
It seems like their approach, policymakers, is in terms of boosting spending, is really unlocking that household wealth, as you mentioned. So in their interpretation, it's not a lack of spending power. Do you agree with that sort of approach here, or is there really a need to really increase household wealth?
I think yes and no. The Chinese household is saving 35% of their income. That's like the highest saving rate globally. And one of the reasons is the lack of a complete social safety net. So covering migrant workers and farmers, poor people with social benefits. That's going to unlock some consumption potential. But meanwhile, is it also because China is in so-called K-shaped recovery? K-shaped is so popular among describing global economy. I doubt, because the thing is, K-shaped means the cake is still growing, right? It's just that you didn't get a fair cut. But if you look at the nominal GDP growth in China, it's quite subdued. It's below 4%. So even the broader economy was not growing as it was, as it's supposed to be. So it's not just K-shaped. I think it is due to this very subdued nominal growth. They have to focus on lifting nominal growth by showing up consumers with social welfare reform, with some services vouchers, and stabilizing the housing sector. That's my New Year resolution. The 3 things: stabilizing housing sector with mortgage subsidy, providing broad-based vouchers for consumers on services sector, and also try to inject more social welfare benefits for farmers.
And should we expect the currency to stay strong too, in ways of boosting imports or even domestic demand in some ways?
I mean, that's the part I'm least worried about. The Chinese exports remain very competitive. Even with all these noises about geopolitics, EU or Mexico tariffs. We think that just make this supply chain longer, lengthier, rather than making it broken, because you can see rerouting, you can see the U.S. are importing more and more from other exporters, but these exporters are importing from China. These high value-added components and parts are all still from China. So we are less worried about China's exports. It's going to be the bright spot, but relying on advanced manufacturing and exports alone do not solve China's domestic deflation problem. So they still have to deliver the rebalance and the reflation at home.
Right. Robin, we'll be tracking, of course, your New Year's resolutions, of course, and your wish list for 2026. Robin Xing there, Morgan Stanley, Chief China Economist, joining us here on the shows. And, of course, subscribers can also turn to the terminal for more on, of course, these economic numbers. And they're already writing quite a bit, in particular when it comes to the retail sales growth. I think that was the biggest disappointment, the weakest print we've seen since COVID, while investment also slumped further as well. T-Live Go is where to go for your functions and, of course, latest updates. This is Bloomberg.